we will have this available afterwards for people to listen to. So again, welcome back to PennFuture Presents Frack This Book. And I want to introduce both of our authors to you. I'm going to start with introducing you to Joel Burcat. And Joel is a novelist and an environmental attorney. His debut novel, Drink to Every Beast, which I enjoyed enormously, was the first in the series of Mike Jacobs' environmental legal thrillers. He's received a whole bunch of awards for his fiction over the past few years, which is great. And he was selected as the 2019 Lawyer of the Year in Environmental Litigation for Central PA by Best Lawyers in America, and has also received Super Lawyers and Best Lawyers designation for environmental and energy law, and was selected by the PA Bar Association as a recipient of its annual award for environmental law. And Joel lives here in Harrisburg with his wife, Gail, which is fantastic. You're just down the street from me. And Fred, also here in Harrisburg. You grew up in Queens, that's where you were born, but I know you lived in Harrisburg a lot off and on. Your first book, The Old Songs, takes place in Queens during the 50s and 60s. And of course, your latest novel, your second novel, is Bountiful Calling. And I know you've spent most of your career working in computer information, both for the government and for the private sector. And you lived in Baltimore for quite a while, but have now come back to Harrisburg, and which is great. Again, right down the street. Welcome back. And it's terrific to have the two of you here with us tonight. What I want to start with, and I do want to remind our listeners, viewers, that you can put questions in the chat or the Q&A that we'll be getting to a little bit later. So make sure we try to get to all of those. But I want to start by having each of you gentlemen describe the basic background of the story of your book. And Fred, if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and start with you and have you tell us a little bit about Bountiful Calling.
Sure, I'd be happy to. In the beginning of the book, you're introduced to Joe, who lives in Harrisburg and is a staffer for the Pennsylvania State Senator representing Williamsport and Loyal-Sauk State Forest area. You learn from him that the senator he works for wants to expand fracking in the community, in his community, in order to bring much needed revenue into the community. Soon after Joe meets Nicole, while visiting Williamsport, and she's the grown daughter of a family that owns a resort in the Loyal-Sauk State Forest area that happens to be named Bountiful. Their attraction grows into a relationship, and she shows them around the area up there, and they explore all the beauty of the place and the culture, and all the things that need to be preserved. And Joe also becomes close to her parents, particularly her father, Gabe. But the plot shifts dramatically when fracking causes Nicole's family to consider doing something that they feel violates them. And I don't want to get too much into that because that would impact the reader's experience, I think. But that sense of violation leads to a tragedy, and that tragedy propels Nicole into a personal odyssey, and that odyssey contains elements of political activism and acts of civil disobedience, but it also contains a sense of spiritual awakening and appreciation for a fuller experience of community. At the same time that Nicole's going through this, Joe is becoming the point person for some very high-profile fracking-related projects. But he tries to balance all of that activity with his pursuit for justice and fairness while working inside the political system. So obviously the relationship goes through a lot of changes, there's a lot of ups and downs and tensions, but they navigate these with a lot of integrity, and they arrive at life choices that are right for them. And I try to portray these choices, as fairly as I can, and I want the reader to get a sense of, what rings with the sound of truth to them. What will they stand with? But I also want them to maybe gain appreciation for points of views other than the ones that they hold themselves.
Excellent. Now, I know that you've said specifically your book is not a thriller, and it's not. But I will say there are a couple chapters that have a little bit of that element in there when there's some intrigue going on about some information that's being passed on. So, but I know but I do want to be clear, it's not a thriller, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But Joel, your books are thrillers. I mean, they are set up as thrillers from the very first one. I see them aligned nicely behind you there, down A Drink to Every Beast and Amid Rage, the second one, and now Strange Fire, the third one in this series. Kind of a little bit of a John Grisham feel to these. So tell me a bit about Strange Fire.
Sure, Travis. And first of all, thank you, and thanks to PennFuture for hosting this event. It's really great to be able to present to everybody tonight, and looking forward to everybody's questions later on. But Strange Fire is a thriller. It's a suspenseful and romantically charged environmental legal thriller about fracking and drilling for natural gas. The story begins as fracking for natural gas has turned deadly in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. And not only is the water contaminated, but people are dying. Round-the-clock operations conducted by Yukon Oil and Gas at their snake-ridden Campbell pad may have poisoned a residential well and threatens a town's water supply. Pennsylvania's environmental agency that we all know and love, DEP, says fracking of the Marcellus Shale by Yukon did not cause the contamination. Well, the neighbors have sued the agency, and Mike Jacobs, who's a 29-year-old environmental lawyer with DEP, is back in this story for the third time and is ordered to represent the Commonwealth's position. Because of the unique nature of the case, Mike finds himself on what he considers to be the wrong side, and Mike suspects ultimately that the neighbors are right, and he must get to the truth of the matter before he becomes a victim too. Now, the story is complicated, of course, because he has to work alongside his law school nemesis, a man named Darius Moore. The two of them were rivals in law school, and Darius Moore is now a rising star at DC's prestigious Finkel and Updike law firm, which is universally referred to as FU. And then Norby LaFleur is a Cajun and Yukon's director of operations, and he grows to hate Mike, and he ends up blaming Mike for all of his troubles. Mike has a friendship with his geologist, Missy Shelton, which grows into something much more than a professional relationship. And there's a citizen activist, Teresa Bruno Campbell, who starts out as a person who has absolutely no political interests and who ultimately becomes a very, very strong and dedicated political activist. But ultimately, she becomes maybe a little bit too interested in Mike when Mike saves her son from a riot. And then we have Roger Alden, who's Mike's friend and his mentor and his boss, who may not be able to save Mike from a serious lapse of judgment. So Mike's efforts to discern the truth put him in the crosshairs of what I believe is a very suspenseful and exhilarating legal mystery.
Excellent. Thank you, Joel. I appreciate that summary. You know, both of you, obviously, fracking is a subject that you're both interested in and have made central to both of your books. And I want to touch, though, on something a little bit bigger than that. And that is this idea of eco-fiction or environmental authors. And, you know, if you think back even maybe a decade or so, and you ask people to name an environmental author for a fiction writer, you know, you might have people say Edward Abbey or Barbara Kingsolver, but there weren't a lot of other names that came immediately to mind. And yet, you know, I've found in the past 10 years or so, so many tremendous books that have been coming out that do include environmental issues as either primary subject matter or certainly the background to what people are writing about. I don't think you could probably fill a bookstore with all the environmental fiction out there. I don't think you could fill a bookstore with books just fiction on fracking, but you never know. Maybe that'll happen. But it's an interesting thing. And PennFuture actually for a while even had a environmental book club that we met regularly and read a lot of fiction that had an environmental basis to it. And so, you know, Joel, I've always been interested in your work when I was first introduced to it because of that. And what I want to ask both of you, and Joel, I'll start with you on this. You know, why is it that you chose to, I mean, you could set your books in you know, anywhere or around any topic, and yet you've made environmental issues so central to it. And, you know, I mean, of course, you're an environmental lawyer, so maybe it's a more obvious answer. But tell me more about, why it is you've chosen that topic and what it means to you to be an eco-author.
Well, it's a great question, and you're very fortunate because I actually made a little study of this. And what troubled me was that you had books, you referred to Edward Abbey, so you have books like The Monkey Wrench Gang, which clearly are environmental fiction. And then you've also got books like Jaws and Jurassic Park, which you could argue are also environmental fiction. And I thought, well, what binds these books together? Because there are big environmental issues in those books. And then you've got environmental legal thrillers like The Pelican Brief and The Appeal and other stories like that. And you've got a whole new genre, which has been out now for a number of years, called cli-fi.
Mm-hmm.
And what I did was I started looking at them and I thought, well, they were just simply being referred to as eco-fiction. And I thought, that's a mistake. You can't refer to all of it as eco-fiction. So what I did was I broke it down, and I have just a few titles. What I did, since this was my list, I broke it down the way I wanted to. So apologies.
I can't wait to hear it. This is awesome. Okay.
Apologies to the rest of the world. I have environmental thrillers, which would include books like The Monkey Wrench Gang. I think tourist season, Carl Hyacin writes a lot of books that are basically environmental thrillers. John McGoran, who's a writer out of Philadelphia, a good writer out of Philadelphia, writes a number of environmental thrillers. There's a fellow, I believe he lives now in the West Coast, named Mike Fitzgerald, who wrote a book called The Fracking War. And you've got a number of other people. Pam Lazos, a friend of ours, has written a book called Oil and Water. Of course, Fred would go into the environmental thriller category, maybe the environmental literature category. But then you've got what I call eco-thrillers. So eco-thrillers are books that are sort of what they might say on TV, your granddad's environmental thrillers. And these would be things like Cat's Cradle and Jaws and Jurassic Park, Relic and Reliquary, Zoo by James Patterson, all stories where man messes around with the environment in some way. And there's a sort of a science fiction element to it. In all of those stories, there's something that requires a little bit of a leap of science fiction faith. And then you've got environmental legal thrillers like mine, my 3 books, Pelican Brief, Civil Action, which is not really fiction. It's actually a nonfiction story by Jonathan Harr. And you've got Erin Brockovich, which again is not a fiction story. That's a nonfiction story. And Gray Mountain by John Grisham. And then finally, you've got cli-fi, and you've got Michael Crichton wrote a cli-fi book, which is interesting because his cli-fi book takes the opposite approach. Basically, he was a climate change denier before he passed away. But then you've got Barbara Kingsolver, who wrote Flight Behavior, and Kim Stanley Robinson, who's written cli-fi. So there is this genre that's out there of environmental fiction, and it's, I think, broken down into these 4 different categories. I think I've seen some other things where people have broken it down differently. Why do I write it? I write it because I think it's important. I think that everybody ought to be aware of these issues. What I try to do, and what I know Fred tries to do, is we try to educate people in our fiction. And you can read textbooks. There are all kinds of textbooks and journal articles and the like that are out there that will make a normal person, fall asleep. But if you can present it in fiction in a way that's interesting and that presents realistic scenarios and it's accurate, I think that makes a big difference to the average reader out there who's looking for something to educate themselves, but also to be entertained. So that's why I do it, because I think it's a really critically important issue.
Well, thank you for that really thoughtful answer. And I like the way you've broken that down. And it's interesting because I think that so many of the books that maybe we think about as classic, climate fiction now were science fiction. And that's kind of the genre that first really, I think, started exploring, like, as you said, how people mess up things. And it's been, I think, maybe more recently that you start to see authors like Barbara Kingsolver and such. And Fred, I really see you much more in that tradition, like Barbara Kingsolver, in that, your novel is really dealing with relationships and people going through, a realistic situation. Not that your thriller is unrealistic, Joel, but I think you know what I mean. And Fred, so, you've got that backdrop, but there is much about family and people and the relationship and romance as anything else. But tell me, the same question, why did you choose to use environmental issues as a background. And you know, I don't believe that you've got the same, you know, you're not an environmental attorney like Joel is. I know you've worked, you know, more in tech, both private and government, but I don't believe it was necessarily in environmental issues. Is that correct? Or, well, you tell me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sure. That's I'd be happy to. So I'll take a more personal tack on this question. And you know, I've been involved in anti-fracking activities for a long time, and I found that the early 2010s was a very surreal time to be aware of these issues and living in Harrisburg. On one hand, you had you know, the political and business leaders talking about, you know, all the you know, the great things, the jobs that are bringing to the area, the money to these depressed regions, you know, the appeal to patriotism, because this would make our country energy independent. But on the other side, you heard some really dark stories, you know, things like, you know, gag orders placed on doctors, not allowing them to talk to their colleagues about fracking-related illnesses, and the DEP classifying complaints made to them about, you know, the harmful effects, you know, on wells going bad, and disease, pockets of disease, and general deterioration of infrastructure. And there was a DEP official who's actually on record saying that the reason they kept this information classified was that they didn't want to alarm people, which is truly amazing. You know, I mean, it's just, so all this, I was trying to make sense of all this. And then I attended a demonstration, and I spoke to people in the affected areas, the Marcellus Shale region. And they made clear to me why they felt their communities were sacrifice zones, and why they themselves felt like collateral damage. And it was that was what inspired me. You know, that's what I said, okay, I want to try to put all this down in as fair and nuanced way as I can. And that's what got me started and propelled me to write the book. But when I consider the question of why eco-fiction now, you know, I think of all the climate change issues that, you know, fracking and fossil fuels, you know, are bringing to the fore. You know, it's causing us to question really long-held beliefs and assumptions, and you know, we're being asked to act in ways that are not, you know, economically, you know, the best. You know, which is a huge departure for us. So we're engaging our freedom. You know, we're engaging, you know, the stories that define our lives. And storytellers can play a really important role in imagining a new direction. And that's really, you know, underlying a lot of what I try to do.
So I'm sure as both of you are authors, you're continuing to write and you keep working on that next book. You know, are you considering, Fred, are you considering your next book to have any sort of, you know, environmental aspect to it?
Well, I just finished a book like 2 days ago, you know, so.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And it's on some level, it's very much an eco book, but it's well, it was, again, there was a single instance, a single thing that got me going on this. And what it was 3 or 4 years ago, I heard Elon Musk interviewed talking about Neuralink, which is a technology that embeds devices in the back of people's brains that allows them to connect directly with computer networks. And there are clearly some great medical applications for this. You know, people who are paralyzed could conceivably start using their limbs again. But this isn't what Musk was focused on, and it's not what I was focused on listening to him. I mean, at one point he said, you know, people won't need to speak in the future to communicate. So that was where he was going, you know, and when I recovered from this interview, you know, I said to myself, I really want to write about humans and technology and humans in the natural world and what it means to be fully human. And so it has absolutely an eco quality because it's about the natural world, and our relationship to it. And so it takes a slightly different tack, and it's sort of, it's a speculative type of novel. But getting back to the other thing, my work seems to be like what I've recently come into contact with, a term called upmarket. Upmarket fiction, from what I understand, is fiction that has some of the traditional devices of fiction to carry a reader along and to keep their interest in, so that I think my books are page turners. I mean, you definitely want to know what's going on, but at the same time, there's a really deep level of involvement in the internal lives of the characters. And I take real chances with the fiction, with the narrative, and I try to build trust with the reader, so that so that they know I'll take care of them. That I might be taking them in some tough places, but they trust that I will be equal to that, and I will I will be respectful of them. And the way you do that is to have a lot of integrity as you're going through it, and not allow yourself to go for a cheapened type of emotion along the way.
Well, I will say, Fred, that I thought actually the most interesting part of your novel was the romantic relationship between the two main characters, and the direction. And again, I don't want to give anything away, but the direction it went in, I thought was very thoughtful and very realistic, if not what I expected. And I enjoy that part of it a lot.
Well, that's good. Yeah. I'm glad to hear you say that. I think that was one of those things. I know what you're, of course, talking about, and I've had like more conservative readers, people with conservative background, saying, if that had gone this other way, you would have lost me. I just couldn't have gone there. But the fact that it was something that they could hold on to, and more, more left-leaning people have said, well, I did admire that state senator, but begrudgingly they admired him because they didn't really want to, but they did. So again, there was a sense, what I was trying to do was give people something, but also try to stretch them beyond that, what they're used to.
We'll get to the politics in just a minute, but Joel, I want to follow up with you. I remember hearing you interviewed recently by Scott Lamar on Smart Talk, and it sounded like you were maybe wrapping up the Mike Jacob books with this as possibly the end of a trilogy and working in another direction for the next book. Or
I hadn't planned on writing a trilogy, but I'm at a point right now where I think Mike Jacobs could take a little bit of a break. Okay. In the first story, in Drink to Every Beast, he was 26 years old. And by comparison, I was 25 when I started out at DER many years ago. So it boggles my mind, by the way, when I look at what I'm going to call kids who are 25, 26 years old, and you realize how much power and authority that we're giving them. But he's a 26-year-old prosecutor with DEP, and he's handling a case dealing with dumping of hazardous waste into the Susquehanna River. And I won't go into the details of it, but the next story, Amid Rage, he's dealing with a permit dispute with basically a psychotic mine operator. And the department is in a very bad position because they've issued a highly conditioned permit to the mine operator, and the mine operator didn't like the conditions, so he files an appeal. And then you have the neighbors who are very close to where the mine is going to be located. Well, they don't want to mine there at all, so they file an appeal. So DEP ends up right in the middle because they've got to defend the permit from the neighbors, and they also have to defend the challenge filed by Rhino Mining Company, which was the name of the mining outfit in that story. And so Mike handles that case. And then in this story, Strange Fire is a fracking book, and that we've been talking about. And I feel as though I'm at a point right now where Mike can take a little bit of a break. Part of it has to do with—
he kind of deserves one. He's been working hard.
He does. He's been working very hard. He's not quite like Jack Reacher, who's on book number 27. But on the other hand, I think Mike deserves a little bit of a break. But it doesn't mean that I've taken a break. So I've actually finished or come close to finishing 3 other books, and I'm working on a new book right now. two of the ones that I finished are absolutely environmental books of one sort or another. So one is actually my first young adult book, and it's a young adult thriller that I started at the beginning of the pandemic. It's about a time after a pandemic when the pandemic has killed all of the adults of the world, and the only ones who survive are children and teenagers. And it's sort of The Road meets Lord of the Flies, if you can imagine that kind of a mashup. And that book is called Lullabies and Other Lies. And then another book that I've written is one in which a young woman accidentally is allowed into a meeting of lobbyists in DC. And what are they talking about? This book is set in the late 1980s. They're talking about legislation that would basically abolish any research on climate change and would prohibit the government from being involved in any activities relating to climate change. She is there for a completely different reason, goes back home. She's a law student, goes back home and manages to get involved with the New York Times, who sends her back basically as a spy to see what's going on in this. And that story is, I think, a very important story because it sort of traces the early days of the climate research that was going on back in the 1980s. The story I'm writing right now, which my working title is called Fire and Ice, I'm very intentionally writing a cli-fi story. And it's about, it's kind of very loosely based on that horrendous storm that took place this past year in November, when you had, and also the one that took place a year earlier in Texas in November, when you had these horrendous winds and rain and snow and all of that. And I've read the IPCC reports, and the IPCC reports specifically say that one thing that we can expect as a result of climate change is that you're going to have this multiplication of events, and that you'll have events that have more than one thing going on. So you'll have wind events and rain events. You'll have, forest, you'll have fires, and you'll have droughts. And many people have said it's very hard to look at a weather event and say that weather is climate. But actually, in the IPCC's first report a couple months ago, they said, in fact, that they were now pointing to certain weather events as being climatologic indications of climatologic change. So this story is about that, and it's about some people going through a mental change where they begin to understand that, in fact, what's causing this to happen is climate change. Okay. So I've been very busy on that front, and it is something that fascinates me. It's something I think is very, very important. And I hope you're going to get to it. And I see you wearing your Ukraine t-shirt, which I'm proud to see you wearing. But I hope we get to the issue of how is all this terrible war in Ukraine going to affect fracking and natural gas and oil production in the United States and climate change. But I'll let you ask the questions.
We will get to some of that as well. In listening to your response, Joel, it of course becomes obvious that it's hard to write about these issues without also writing about science and without also writing about government. Let's talk about science first, just a little bit. Fred, one really pivotal moment, or I guess pivotal science piece in your book, is the fact that Gabe, when he bought this land that he has his resort on years ago, that he didn't realize he was buying the property but not buying the mineral rights, and that the person who sold him the land but kept the mineral rights, and then willed it to his children, who then decide that they want to use those mineral rights for fracking. That's just an extraordinary thing to read, that first off, that someone could own property and not own the mineral rights. How often does that happen, or have you seen that? Have you been aware of something like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, it's called a split lease, and I know quite a bit about it. I'm sure Joel could kind of talk to it as well, but that is quite common, and it's even more common in West Virginia, from what I understand, than Pennsylvania. But it is common in Pennsylvania, and that is pivotal. I mean, it's intended to shock the reader because it's almost unthinkable. I mean, you can't even, if you don't know about this and you read about that, what do you own? You own a little sliver of top of what is it? And really what that's intended to do, it's somewhat subversive in a way. It's intended to even bring into question the whole idea of private property. I mean, because, and we can't really feel that the extent of how dislocating that must be to someone who doesn't know anything about that, but we can sense it when we think about what happened to Gabe, because that does have a visceral effect on us. So it's intended to be a thoughtful experience, for the reader, and it does happen, and people don't know when they're in leases or that they don't own the mineral rights. And from what I understand, that goes back to, when drilling was conventional. Now it's unconventional. It's much more invasive. You go down miles and then you pivot miles. And it requires much more infrastructure. Before, when most of that split lease, historically existed, from what I understand, it was when drilling was less invasive. There was almost an agreement between the drilling company and the landowners about getting free oil, and there wasn't the impacts that there is now. And these are real concerns. People do not know that they don't own the mineral rights, and they get shafted, because of this, and it's a real tragedy.
Yeah, it really is. It breaks your heart when you read about it, whether it's in fiction or in the real world, and it certainly happens. Joel, a key plot point for both of your books, your book and Fred's book, is this idea that both the fracking companies and some government entities, are pushing this myth that, we call it fracked gas here at PennFuture, but that natural gas is somehow clean and green, and, by fracking it, that there's no effect on the environment. There's no, it doesn't poison the water. It doesn't increase climate change. All those myths we know to be completely untrue. That the science is very clear that fracking, does actually cause, harm to the water table, that it does increase the methane in the air and other issues that lead to climate change. To me, it kind of boggles my mind that not just that the fracking companies and some regulatory agencies, still push this myth, but so many people believe it. And as you alluded to, here we are right now, we've got some state legislators who are calling environmental groups unpatriotic because we're not encouraging more fracking to send natural gas to Europe right now because of what's going on in Ukraine, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And I know that was something you wanted to talk about, so I'm setting you up for it.
Thank you very much, Travis. It's a very serious issue. I'm going to speak to this, and then I just want to jump back to something that Fred was just saying, but first I'll speak to this issue. And that is the war in Ukraine is absolutely going to have an impact here in Pennsylvania. And you say to yourself, how could that possibly be? We're thousands of miles away from Ukraine, and it's an awful, terrible thing. And Putin is a murderer, and he's a war criminal, and all of that. But how could what's going on over there have an impact over here? And the way it has an impact here is the supply chain has been disrupted in Europe right now, because Europe depends on Russia for 40% of its natural gas. Plus, don't anybody think that this war in Ukraine is only about a madman named Putin. It's also about natural resources. Ukraine has unbelievable natural resources. It's the second or third largest amount of coal in all of Europe. It's the second largest amount of natural gas in all of Europe. They have resources in metals, titanium and lithium and other metals like that And they're at first or second or third in the world on some of those metals. They've got unbelievable quantities of natural resources in a country that's the size of Texas. So it really is huge what it has over there. But because of the disruption to the supply chain and the disruption in natural gas going to Europe, that has an effect, because what's happened now is that in the past, since January, since the buildup to the war, the price of natural gas in Europe has skyrocketed. And as it's skyrocketed, what has happened is that LNG, liquefied natural gas, has been very economical. It's very expensive. Imagine to take gas from a well in Susquehanna County and to get it to a terminal someplace and compress it to the point that it's liquefied, stick it on the back of a ship, and then send it over via ship to Europe, or from Qatar or other countries in Africa where they also ship natural gas. But it's now become economical to do that. And the price of oil too, by the way, I just saw that it was $117 a barrel. So the price of oil has also gone up. So all of these natural resources, and PS, as everybody knows, we have that in Pennsylvania. All of these natural resources have gone up in price. And as the price goes up, that means that it's much more profitable to remove this stuff from the ground and to ship it to Europe. And by the way, when you take it out of the ground in Pennsylvania and you run it through a pipeline in Pennsylvania and you put it on a ship in the harbor in Delaware or in Philadelphia or wherever, it's really doing nothing to benefit Pennsylvanians. Yes, sure, there may be some impact fee money that's generated as a result of that, but it's really other than that, it's really doing nothing to help Pennsylvanians. And so this war over there, because it's disrupted the supply chain to Europe and to other places, is resulting, in fact, in a call. And Seth Grove, a representative, and other state representatives and senators, in fact, are calling into question the patriotism of environmentalists who are saying that we should be cutting back, that the real way to get to not have madmen in Europe have control over the world is to get away altogether from carbon-based fuels. If you had renewables, if you didn't have carbon-based fuel, you wouldn't have to worry about a guy like Putin playing with the amount of natural gas that's going to go to Europe. But that seems to be falling on some deaf ears right now. But just a quick point to Fred. One of the things that I learned in law school is something known as the 3 estates in land. And the 3 estates in land are the surface, the minerals, and what's known as the right of subjacent support. And it usually applied to something like a mine, situated like a strip mine, or a deep mine, where one owner could own the minerals and somebody else would own the surface. And we won't get into that, because that you could talk for a day about that issue alone. But it is a huge issue. What's interesting is that there's the Bituminous Mine Subsidence Act in Pennsylvania, which is a pretty old law that requires that if you have a deed where the coal has been severed, as they call it, where the coal has been severed from the land, the deed has to have in like 14-point red type. It has to list that the coal has been severed from the land. But there's nothing like that for gas, and there's nothing like that for other minerals. So it can be, it's the kind of thing that should come up, I would think, in a normal title search. But even so, people are more interested in the house that they're buying. They're more interested in the land that they're getting. They're not really thinking about the fact that they don't own the minerals, especially if there's no mining or gas drilling taking place. Right. So long story short, it is an issue. It's the only protection that exists right now in Pennsylvania, the only statutory protection that exists, is in the Bituminous Mine Subsidence Act.
Joel, I just want to, going back to Russia, Ukraine, I just put a link into the chat to a blog written by 2 people who are a lot smarter than I am about this stuff. Our Vice President and Chief of Staff for PennFuture, Matt Stepp, as well as our policy analyst, John Ukeni, just published 2 days ago a blog, Russian-Ukraine Crisis, War, Fossil Fuels, and What It Means for Pennsylvanians. It's worth taking a look at. So just
Yeah,
wanted
I
to
read
share
that. It's a very good report. It's a good summary of the issues. But the other thing you should just take a look at is just Google these two words, Ukraine and natural resources.
Mhm.
And you'll be shocked at how many natural resources there are in Ukraine. I was when I started looking into this. And my family is Ukrainian. So, I mean, it was shocking to me. My family didn't know any of that stuff. We were lucky. My family was lucky to sleep on a dirt floor.
Well, I want to ask you both one more question before we open it up to our audience for Q&A. I had just asked you a few minutes ago about science, which is obviously something that you can't get away from in environmental fiction. But the other side of that is government. And both of you, I really enjoy the way both of you write about government and about state government specifically, and about not just necessarily the legislators or representatives that you see, but the people working behind the scenes. My wife works for the DEP, and I at PennFuture obviously hear a lot from our policy people and lobbyists about what's going on and that they see. And so I read those parts of your books and think, wow, these guys are really nailing it. And I'm curious, what it is that I know you both have experiences that you bring to writing about government, but as you do that, do you find yourself, I don't know, maybe thinking back to something specific, tweaking someone you worked with before, whatever it may be? I'll start with you, Fred. Let's hear from you a little bit about when you're writing about government issues and people in it.
Yeah, I hit it on a couple different ways, and one that I felt strongly about was the role consultants play. And I just felt like they are very disruptive, and that they break the flow of the people doing the work. And if there's any bad guys in my book, it's that group. That they don't have much skin in the game, and they come in and they take over processes and make a mess of things. And Joe at the end more or less says, I'm going to keep them the hell out of my business, when he sees the effects that they have on him and the work he's been doing. So for him, that was a big a big turning point. And I didn't work in the DEP, but I have a friend who does, and at a high level. And when he read the book, he said to me, he said, "So whose ear did you have?" And that made me feel really, really good, because really, you don't have to work there. I mean, you just have to be, the period of time I was writing about was like in the early 2010s, and you just had to be aware of all the shenanigans going on. And it wasn't that hard to put the pieces together and to lay blame where it deserved to be laid. Yep. And that was really what I was working from as much as anything.
I found your take on consultants and how they disrupt things really fascinating. So yeah, that was a good part of the book. Joel, right. I'll ask you the same question.
Well, you can't live in Harrisburg and not be affiliated, associated, involved in some way with government. And I was both in government as a young lawyer at DER, and then subsequently I was in private practice. And I mean, you're always involved in one way or another with, whether it's DEP or whether it's some other agency. You're always bumping into people who are lobbyists and who walk the hallways of the legislature, and it's almost like apples and oranges in terms of the rest of the world and what they're doing. And what Fred described in his book, which I thought was really spot on in terms of the consultants in particular, he was also very spot on, I thought, in terms of the legislators and the legislative process and the wheeling and dealing that takes place. You just can't live in Harrisburg and not have a pretty good knowledge of it if you're interested in that. And, you talk to some people who, you're always bumping into people who are either current legislators or former legislators, and or people who want to be legislators. And so you're always bumping into people who've got an interest in it. And it's probably one of the easiest conversations that you can have in Harrisburg is about government and governing and about what goes on. And if you're here at all for more than 10 minutes, you end up becoming very, very cynical about government because you start seeing that even the good guys ultimately often become something other than the good guys. And I think that was one of the things that Fred talked about in his book. And I know in my other books, I have themes of that running through those books as well about people who maybe at one time had good intentions, but over time have become solely interested in themselves rather than the people.
So I said I was going to do, that was the last question, but I actually want to ask one more. And then I do want people to start putting your questions in either the chat or the Q&A, and we'll get to as many as possible. Would love to see some come through, so please feel free to type them in now. But how did the two of you guys meet? Because you see, I mean, you're obviously interested in similar things, and you seem like you're good friends. And Joel, again, I appreciate you introducing me to Fred, but how'd you two get connected?
I think we actually met at Midtown Scholar, didn't we, Fred?
We did, and in fact, we met there in a writers group.
Right.
And in fact, I was writing Bountiful Calling, and I knew you were a lawyer, and you confirmed that whole idea about the split lease. I knew about it, but I wasn't 100% sure. And when you told me, I think I slammed my fists on the table. I said, I got it. That's right. Okay. So I don't know if you remember that, but it was it was a turning point for me. Like, okay, I'm onto something here, and I ran with it. So thanks for bringing that up, Travis.
There's actually a pretty good. There's actually a pretty good writers community in central Pennsylvania and Harrisburg, and we had for a time, maybe 8 or 10 years, we had a writers group that met once a month upstairs at Midtown Scholar, and we pretty much stopped at about the time COVID set in. We tried to continue on Zoom for a while, but it really didn't work for us. And I'll just put a plug in again for Midtown Scholar. First of all, it's an independent bookstore. Secondly, they're great people over there. And thirdly, they have Fred and my books available.
That's right.
And all you have to do is click on the link and you can get, are your books autographed, Fred?
They are, in fact, yes.
Mine are too. So you can get autographed books, which that other big place that named itself after a gigantic river in South America doesn't have. So I encourage you all to go over to Midtown Scholar or to call them or go online.
And Joel, I believe they actually have a special package of all three of your books together that you can get over there at Midtown. Yes,
they did a package to reduce the price. So if you get all three of the books, you'll get it at a discounted price, a good discount.
That's pretty cool.
Mine is also discounted if you're over there and interested.
Yep, a comment about how Midtown Scholar at one time was the center of anti-fracking organizing in Harrisburg. That actually leads to another question that came up, and that is, where do both of you stand with fracking as a whole? Is it something that we should be mitigating? Is it something we should be getting rid of entirely? Of course, there's always the argument that some people make who are for it, that it brings jobs, and we talked about the myth earlier of it not affecting the environment, which is totally untrue. But where do the two of you stand? And Joel, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. My number one position is that we need to do away with carbon-based fuel of all kinds. So whether it's coal, oil, or gas, we need to do away with all of that. And what I'd like to see in as short a time as possible is that we get away from all of that fuel. You read the IPCC report, in fact, the one that just came out yesterday, and you see that yet again, it reaffirms the fact that we are really on borrowed time so far as climate change is concerned. This most recent report says by the end of the decade, it's going to be too late. And most of that is because of the reliance that we have on carbon-based fuels. The problem that we have right now in Pennsylvania is that so much of our electricity generation is based on natural gas and coal to a lesser extent. I happen to have the statistics here because I'm a good lawyer and I always have I always bring the receipts. But according to the statistics, if you look at Pennsylvania in 2010, 48% of electric generation was coal-based, and 15% was natural gas. And in 2020, so just 10 years later, only 10% was coal and 52% was natural gas generated. That's from the EIA, a federal agency. Wow. So you take a look at those statistics and you say, you know, we'd like to get away from this carbon-based fuel and do it as quickly as possible. But how do you go from 52% and 10%, that's 62% of our energy coming from coal and natural gas, and bring it down to zero and do it quickly? And, you know, you realize that it's an unbelievably complicated issue. We want to do that. I'd like to see that happen personally. And that would be my goal ultimately, is to see that happen. But there's there's just a part of it that just slaps you in the face and says, well, how are you going to make up all that energy? You can't possibly economize. There aren't enough solar panels right now or wind turbines right now to make up for that. How are you going to deal with that? I mean, obviously, I'd like to see it happen as soon as possible. And IPCC and others, it's not just IPCC, have made it very, very plain and clear that we are really living on borrowed time so far as climate change is concerned. So as soon as possible, doing away with all carbon-based fuels.
Fred, how about you?
Yeah, I second everything he said there. It can be very overwhelming and distressing, and those are the emotions we need to push it back against. Because if we give up, or if we look at that sum of all the negative reporting and of what we're up against, and it's easy to not want to engage it, and that gets back to what I was getting at a little bit before, and that's perhaps the role that fiction like ours may have to present to people a new story, a new way to feel connected and to value again future generations and the world that we're giving them, and get away from the type of lifestyle that has caused the problems that Joel described so well. And maybe that's the role of storytellers, and maybe we can help that, because people have been hit over the head with these facts, and it's not really changing the mark so much. So maybe the role of imagining what a better, different way that we can embrace that would be sustainable and regenerative is what we need to think about as well. I'm not discounting all of the science and the research. It all has to happen in the innovation, but maybe we need to also connect on a almost spiritual level to what our purpose here is.
No, I think that's very true, and I think that coming at it in different ways is such an important thing to do. If people got onto our call a little bit early, I was mentioning then how in about a month on April 7th, PennFuture is going to be doing another talk like tonight's on eco art in action, which is a book by a number of artists looking at what eco art is, and whether it, and a lot of artists are both making environmental issues the subject matter of their work, but also some are using environmental things as the actual material. And in other cases, you've got artists who are actually trying to make a change with their work, and that the work itself generates clean energy or in some way removes pollutants from the air or the water. Really fascinating stuff going on, both I think with artists like that and then writers like yourself, who are approaching this in different ways to try to, get people to think about it in a way that moves them, or maybe just the facts and the numbers don't. We've got a little bit of time left, so I do encourage you, if you've got a question, to put it either in the chat or the Q&A. We do want to wrap up at 6:30 and be cognizant of everyone's time. But I want to just take this moment to thank both of you for your time and the work that you've been doing. Really enjoy reading both of you. And any additional comments that either of you would like to make? Joel, I'll give you the floor first.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that one of the things that I've tried to do in my story in all of my books is to try to present the science so that people can understand the science and understand it in a way that's an enjoyable way of understanding it, so that it's not like you're reading a textbook or you're back in college or high school and learning about some complicated thing that is boring you to tears. I try to present it in such a way that my stories are very accurate in terms of the scientific and engineering stuff in it. And at the same time, I try to present a story that has the different factions in it. I know Fred did that in Bountiful Calling. I do that in my story, where we both present the different factions. So, I have the oil company representatives talking. I have some lawyers talking in my story. I've got a professor from Penn State talking. These are all supporters of fracking. On the other hand, you've got the neighbors talking who are opposed to fracking. There's an environmental group that's mentioned in my story opposed to fracking, and they're presenting the opposite side of the issue. It's not interesting to anybody, I don't think, if you just simply say, oh, I'm going to be completely even-handed, I'm going to try and present this in an even-handed way. I don't know that you can. So I find, at least in storytelling, that it's much better to say, okay, this mother who has become very politically active is going to say this, and these things are what I believe people who feel that way would be saying. And then this person who works for the drilling company is going to say these other things. And I believe that people are intelligent and that they're going to read these stories and they're going to make up their own minds for themselves. And so that's something that I've tried to do in Strange Fire and in my other stories as well. The previous book, Amid Rage, especially about coal mining in Pennsylvania, taking place in Somerset County. So it's something that I think is very important and critical to my story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Fred, I'm going to actually toss to you first a question we just got from one of the members of our audience, Brenda, who actually used to be part of the PennFuture Climate Book Club, and wanting to know from the two of you other authors that you would recommend or who've inspired you, in the work that you do, that you would be willing to share.
One environmental book that I found, deeply engaging was The Overstory. I think Powers is the man's name, the author's name. I can't remember his first name, but it really took me. I had a very strong reaction to him, and I think that's as good an environmental book as you can find.
Yeah, that is a great book, and because I go more to the genre thriller side of things, I would say, if you haven't read The Monkey Wrench Gang, you've got to read it. Edward Abbey. That's really the granddaddy of all environmental fiction. And I reread it recently. I read it years and years ago, and then I reread it about maybe a year or so ago, and it's as fresh today as it was when it came out in the 1970s. There are other people who write, and a lot of their writing involves environmental issues. One of my favorites is Carl Hiaasen. He's a reporter from the Miami Herald, and he likes to write about Florida and in particular the Everglades. And he writes, you don't even realize that you're reading in a book about the environment until you about halfway through. You say, oh my God, this is really about the environment and environmental issues. Other books, and I'm looking at my list here. Oh, you've got to read, Grisham certainly has written 3 really good books, The Pelican Brief, The Appeal, and Gray's Mountain. And I think all of those books also present important environmental issues. And so I would say, if you're looking for something that is not a deep or dense book, but where you're going to enjoy the book, but at the same time learn something, you could read all of those. By the way, on my website, joelburcat.com, I have a list of these books. So I'm spitting them out there, and you may not have had a chance to write them down, but all you have to do is remember my name, Joel Burcat. It's joelburcat.com. Go to my blog, and I have a little description of what I call the 4 different subgenres of environmental fiction. And then I have a list of the different books that fit into that, at least as I would designate it. So that's something you can go take a look at, and I think that'd be something interesting for many of you.
We are going to wrap this up in just a minute, because I do want to be cognizant of the time specifically here. We did have one person though ask if your books are available, either of you, through Ingram Book Distributors. if that's something that you work with.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
My books are available. Baker and Taylor actually distributes my books, but not Ingram. But they're certainly available on Amazon and
Midtown Scholar.
and at Midtown Scholar.
Yeah.
And the other thing too is my publisher, Headline Books, which is an independent press. So my publisher, Headline Books, also has a website where you can go and get them directly from the publisher. But if you want to get a copy of the book that's autographed, you can go there to midtownscholar.com, I believe it is, and you can get both Fred and my books right from Midtown Scholar. And they make it as easy as
they
that
ship
other
too.
big place.
Yep.
And they'll ship.
I see that Karen Bernard was asking me a question, and I don't know if we have time to take care of this, but I also have a website, fredfburton.com. And Karen, if you would like to message me there, I'd be happy to continue the conversation that your question, represents.
Oh, and Karen's with the East End Food Co-op, which has been a great supporter of PennFuture in the past and was seen about possibly selling the book there. So maybe you guys can get connected after the fact to figure out a way.
That'd be great. Yes.
That'd be awesome.
Awesome.
Terrific. Well, we're going to wrap this up here, but I do want to just mention again that this was brought to you tonight by PennFuture, and you can always find out more information about PennFuture at pennfuture.org, about becoming a member, as well as you can listen to our new podcast, which we just launched this week, called Environmental Voices, the PennFuture podcast. The first episode is all about environmental justice issues, and you can listen to that anywhere you listen to your podcasts, as well as directly through PennFuture. And thanks again to Midtown Scholar for being able to sell these books and for continuing to support great authors like the two of you as well. Even though they weren't a sponsor of the event tonight, we've done a lot of work with them, PennFuture and Midtown, and love working with them. And Joel and Fred, very specifically to you, thank you both so much for your time and for writing these books. And it's really been an enjoyable conversation for me, and I think for all of our audience members.
Thanks so much for doing this and putting it together, Travis. I've really appreciated it, really enjoyed it.
Travis, thank you for your questioning. It was really a great interview. We appreciated it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good conversation, gentlemen. Okay, and I will say to everyone else, thank you again for attending, and look for information about our next book event with eco artists coming up in April. And thank you again for all your support. I hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you all. Good night.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Good night. Good night.